Hey, how's it going everyone? Mike the Manic Geek here, and I've got something of a roundup review here for you today. So I'm going to be taking a look at 3 different heat sinks that have been reintroduced or introduced to the US market from a company called Scythe. They've been around for a while. I can't say I blame you if some of you haven't heard of them in recent history, but we're going to take a look at 3 of their newest products right now and see how they stack up against each other, throw them up against some water coolers, and then talk about my user experience with them and whether or not these are worth your money. So we got a lot to talk about, not a lot of time to talk about it. If you want to skip around to the different parts of the video, I'll have some timestamps down in the video description so you can jump straight to the most relevant information for you. Ready? 1, 2, 3, go! Alright guys, so got a lot to talk about. Gonna try and keep this as succinct as possible, but again, there should be links in the video description to all the different sections for this video, so if you want to skip around to something, feel free to do that. But we're going to start off with the visuals for all 3 of these heat sinks. Scythe, in large part, has decided to go with a mostly color-neutral aesthetic here with these highly polished aluminum fin stacks on all of the heat sinks, and then the black and gray coloring on all of the included fans. Now the Mugen 5 comes with a single 120mm fan, and this particular one I'm actually going to be doing a deep dive with in a future video because they do sell this fan separately. The Fuma also comes with 2 of its own fans. They are a slightly different model and have slightly different specifications, but are by and large every bit as capable as the fan for the Mugen 5. And lastly, the Grand Kama Cross 3 comes with a single 140mm fan that is set for 120mm hole spacing. So just keep that in mind. If you ever wanted to replace this fan with something different, you will need to accommodate that spacing. So you can already see that visually, the caps for the fin stacks on all 3 of these heat sinks are very different, with the Fuma having basically just the ends of the heat pipes just unfinished, sticking out of the top of a very highly polished and unfortunately fingerprint and dust magnet top fin here. And they unfortunately have something of an uneven finish. It's not something that's super noticeable unless you're just staring at it, but if you have any sort of OCD isms, then this may trigger the crap out of you. The Grand Kama Cross 3 took a different approach to this by having these black aluminum caps on top of the fin stacks that have a pressed Scythe logo into them with some additional slots just to, you know, let a little bit more air flow past them if need be. It actually cleans up really cleanly. I kind of wish they would have used a solution like this on the Fuma as well. I think it would have cleaned up a lot nicer. The Mugen's finish on top is probably my hands-down favorite, however. It has this sort of sandblasted finish aluminum top for this fin, but it doesn't really show fingerprints all that well. The heat pipes have these artfully done caps on the end of them that give the entirety of the surface here a really uniform and clean finish. You also get these access ports here to reach down into the fasteners for mounting this to your CPU. And probably the only thing I would have changed here is just changing the orientation of the Scythe logo about 90 degrees that way. Now another point of note on the Mugen 5 is that because it is a 6 heat pipe heatsink, in order to make this compatible with more sockets, they had to offset the fin stack from the cold plate here. So in order to maintain compatibility with say an X299 socket, they had to make this notch in the fin stack here in order to accommodate heat spreaders on either side of your CPU socket. Of note with the Grand Kama Cross 3 is that it uses 2 6mm and 2 8mm heat pipes. These 2 are what differentiates this model from the Grand Kama Cross 2, as well as having nickel-plated heat piping and a slightly different design to the fin array, which basically has these notched edges over here to give you a little bit more surface area contact with airflow, since this fan is set pretty far away from the fin stacks, and we'll discuss what effect that had on cooler performance later on. The Fuma also does a really good job of packaging the fin stacks in such a way that this does maintain compatibility with all 4 DIMM slots on a typical board like something AM4 LJ1151. However, if you have a particularly tall DIMM, you still will not be able to clear memory with a fan on the push side of the fin stack over here. So just as a point of note for my testing, I had to set the fans in the center and towards the rear of the case. But it's cool that you can do that, and they do also add clips for mounting a 3rd fan onto this if you wanted to. I could not do testing with that this time around, but in the future, who knows. Now, before we go on to discussing the different mounting systems used for these heat sinks, I want to talk about this particular accessory. Now, all of these heat sinks obviously come with all of the required mounting hardware that you're going to need for whatever CPU socket you're using. But only 2 of them come with this magnetic tip, short handle, long shank screwdriver. That would be the Mugen 5 and the Grand Kama Cross 3. The issue I have with that is that if you'll look at the Fuma, you actually kind of need this screwdriver to access the fasteners for the mounting bracket on this as well. And just for a little bit more reference, that's where the handle is. So yeah, this would have been a really nice accessory to include with the Fuma, and frankly, I'm a little shocked that it didn't include it. Something else I wanted to touch on was the cold plates for these heat sinks. The Fuma and the Mugen 5 actually use the same exact copper base that is nickel plated, really good machining on these, and it does allow for accommodating 6 heat pipes. The Grand Kama Cross 3, however, has a visibly smaller surface area than the other ones do, and therefore it's only accommodating 4 heat pipes to each of the fin stacks. And as you can see, the way they have to sort of stagger around one another, it kind of makes for an unbalanced assembly, and I will actually touch on that later on in this video. And now, onto the mounting hardware. Alright, so we have all of the mounting mechanisms in place. A couple quick notes before I move on. I forgot to actually mention earlier that the Fuma Revision B comes with its own two-fan splitter so that you can run both of the included fans off of a single motherboard header. It's pretty decently braided, not the best in the world, and it is still using ketchup and mustard cables underneath, but it's still a nice inclusion to have. Just bear in mind, only one of these cables will actually register fan RPM, so the other cable is kind of a slave cable in that instance, in that it will react based on the RPM input from this fan. Also, all of the heat sinks do come with some of Scythe's own thermal paste. Both the Fuma and the Mugen included a tube of paste like this one, which is good for about, I would say, 3 to 4 applications of thermal paste. And while the Grand Kama Cross 3 does come with thermal paste, the packaging is lacking. So here's the mounting mechanisms. So as I mentioned, these are all compatible with all of the relevant Intel and AMD sockets. AM4, however, was a bit of a recent addition. So some of these heat sinks might not come with an AM4 compatible bracket system included. As it just so happened, all of mine are newer packaging, so they do have it included. However, if you happen to be a Scythe owner and you have either the Ninja 4, the Fuma, or either of the 2 previous revisions of the Grand Kama Cross, you can purchase the bracket. It's around $5 or so. Kind of a shame that you have to pay for this additional bracket, but that's one of those business discussions that I'm gonna save for a different video. You can draw your own assertions from that. I personally don't think this is terrible. So, the mounting systems. I'm going to start with the Grand Kama Cross 3 mounting system because this one represents Generation 1. So For starters, this, like all of the other mounting systems for these heatsinks, are going to require the AMD backplate in order to use them. By the way, I am going to be focusing on AMD-specific mounting since that's the testing hardware that I have access to. So your mileage with Intel will definitely vary, but the mounting systems aren't terribly different from what I can tell. So you can see on this one, if you're going to mount it AMD, it has to be AM3+. There is only one place for the screw to thread in. This does thread in like a thumb screw into the back plate on your AMD motherboard, and then it has a threaded opening in the center of the this knurled opening at the top that another fastener will thread into to support the mounting bracket. Now the heatsink bracket is about as basic as it gets. It's a keyed metal bar that has two threaded fasteners that go in at either side. It's not that the fastener itself is bad, and they do enable you to use a small wrench or a Phillips head screwdriver on this if you would like. The problem is, with the first generation mounting system, they required the use of this plastic gasket here. And basically, if the measurements for your AMD backplate were a bit different, since there were a couple of different revisions of that backplate that were made, you would need to use a second spacer in here. That kind of feels like an awful lot of work just to get a backplate mounted. And I'll go ahead and run some video footage here. This particular heatsink was a royal pain in the butt to mount. The Grand Comma Cross 3, granted, does give you a long shank screwdriver to take care of actually reaching the fasteners, but even if the motherboard were laying down, this is just a really tedious and frankly nerve-wracking mounting system, because if you over-torque this one way or another too much, you run the risk of causing damage to your components underneath, and that's something that's a lot easier to do than I think some people give that process credit. Now, Gen 2 of this mounting system functions a hell of a lot better than Gen 1, and I'm going to actually just focus on the Fuma mounting system here, since functionally it's the same between the Fuma and the Mugen. It's just the Mugens will mount with a different orientation, so they'll mount on the left and right hand side of the socket instead of on the top and bottom like the Fuma heatsink does. But essentially what you have here is, well, the AM4 mounting kit. Like I said, mine came sort of pre-packaged with all the necessary mounting hardware. But you can see here that there are two hole spacings, where on the original mounting system there was only one. This was a really easy fix in tooling to correct. Really, any of the rest of the reshaping here is probably for additional structural rigidity and reliability in the long term. Now, the problem that I have with the new revision is it feels almost like they took a bit of a step backwards here. So this is what you need to use to affix the mounting bracket onto the motherboard, and it's basically a plastic slug here that has two different size openings, with the larger opening needing to go over the piece of the AMD backplate that sticks through the motherboard. You then have to position this over that opening, thread the screw through really carefully, and hope you can tighten it down and keep it in place to do the other side without breaking any components. The rest of the mounting is actually really easy, as I touched on earlier on when we were looking at the Fuma up close. These spring tension screws make it so that between that and having the bracket physically mounted to the heatsink, there's no way you're going to be able to over-torque this to the point of damaging components on your motherboard. So in general, I do like the direction this one went, but I would really honestly like to see the return of this particular mounting system for the bracket. I feel like this, with this, is going to give you the best of both worlds, but unfortunately, it doesn't actually work. The height on this piece is a bit different from the height of the plastic here. You can even sort of see in the camera that it is slightly different. So I would have to get a washer or something underneath this, and that could affect more than just clearance later on down the line. Alright, so here's the performance testing results for all of these heat sinks. Just wanted to bring up a few notes real quick while you guys just take a look at all the information. The Scythe Grand Comma Cross 3 does not have silent profile testing results, as this cooler basically needed to run at max fan speed anyway in order to keep my processor in check at all of its settings. You'll also find my system specs used for testing, as well as some information about the fans that were supplied for each of the side heat sinks. It should also be noted that for all of the coolers other than the H100i V1, I did have to use two Antec Tri-Quiet fans in the roof, set at the medium fan speed setting. Alright, so let's discuss using all of these heat sinks. For the most part, I didn't really have a problem with installation on any of them. Even using the Grand Comma Cross 3's early gen H.P.M.S mounting system, it really wasn't too big a deal, much less so if you're installing this on a motherboard that's outside of the case. It turns out you can actually bottom out the screws that hold this bracket in place and not really have any worry about over-tightening anything. It's just sort of hard to gauge that when you don't have the spring tension that the Fuma and the Mugen 5 have on their improved mounting system. It's also a bit more vague in that you can't attach the mounting crossbar for this heatsink directly to the heatsink like you can with the Mugen 5 and the Fuma. Now that being said, some of my testing was a little bit delayed for this review because unfortunately the Grand Comma Cross 3 that I was sent did come with a faulty fan. However, after going through some troubleshooting steps with Scythe and keeping them up to date with everything, they were able to get me a new fan sent out for the heatsink and revalidated all of my testing. Everything was still the same, except now I didn't have a vibration that I could feel through my desk. But still, by and large, the fact that all three of these heat sinks were capable of taming a 125 watt TDP chip that was being overclocked using 1.45 volts more or less, that's pretty impressive for all of these, especially considering that not a one of them runs over $50 MSRP at this point, which is really good pricing and really good performance for heat sinks like these. Now, along with easy installation for all these, you also had extremely quiet operation across the board, including using the two-fan Fuma Revision B. Because of my current testing environment, I'm unfortunately incapable of getting any sort of sound samples for these heat sinks, so I may come back and readdress that in a future video. But know that all three of these operate extremely quietly up until the very upper limits of fan RPM with these, and even then it's more just the sound of rushing wind rather than an obnoxious bearing noise, which really is what you want to avoid with any type of cooling solution. Really, if I had anything to say specifically about any of these in summation here, it would be that the Grand Comma Cross 3 is probably the most sleeper performer of the bunch, since you don't really expect its design to be capable of doing what it does while also providing some downdraft cooling for all the surrounding components for your processor. That's really nice for especially a sort of slim profile environment where this heatsink can draw in air directly from outside of the case, or even if you were using it in a tall enough server rack where you had a bunch of like Xeon chips with a bunch of DIMMs flanking them on either side and you wanted to keep the whole thing cool, but didn't necessarily want to invest in something like water cooling for your server rack. The Fuma Revision B definitely offers the best out-of-the-box performance, and while I didn't have the time to, or the resources for that matter, to check 3-fan cooling on this heatsink, it did show some really promising cooling results, and honestly, of all three of these, it was the easiest to install. But I can't really give a sort of easiest to install award for it because it was the only heatsink in the bunch that didn't include that really nice screwdriver that came with the Mugen 5 and the Grand Comma Cross 3, something that would have made installation on that one truly the easiest of the bunch. It unfortunately is also saddled with the inability to accommodate really tall heat spreaders unless you shift the fans over, so I'm not unfortunately certain how that impacts cooling performance on this heatsink, but I would imagine it's not by a significant margin. The Mugen 5 Revision B, however, really offers sort of the best of all of these heatsinks. You have the H.P.M.S 2 mounting system, which is precise and easy to work with. You have a silent operating fan that offers extremely good cooling performance for a single fan heatsink solution that is also capable with something like an X299 platform that has DIMMs flanking both sides of the CPU socket, and it scales reasonably well when adding a second fan to the configuration. And even with the second fan added, it doesn't really pick up a whole lot of noise in the process because it's really not operating at particularly high RPMs at that point. So as far as the best of the bunch is concerned, I would definitely give that to the Mugen 5 Revision B, and that's definitely the one that you should consider for your next air cooling venture, especially given that the height clearance requirements for that heatsink are not very unreasonable at all. In fact, all of these heat sinks, with the exception of the Grand Kama Cross 3, have very low height clearance requirements. Now, I only say that with the Grand Kama Cross 3 because it is downdraft, and you have to make sure you have enough space between the side panel and the fan to let it breathe. But guys, that's gonna wrap it up for this one. Thank you so much for sitting through this entire video. Thank you to Scythe for sending these products out to me for review. I'm gonna try and include them in some future content, so definitely stay tuned and stay subscribed if you wanna catch that. Give me a thumbs up if you liked what you saw. Leave me a comment down in the comments below. And as always, I will catch you guys next time. So take it easy.